Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, today I want to be talking to you about the nuts and bolts of morality. What is it to be moral, and what is morality, right? So, in order to establish what morality is, let's talk about what it isn't. Morality is not descriptive, which is to say, um, if you ask a scientist what they're in the business of doing, right? They'll tell you that they are in the descriptive business. That is, that they would tell you that they purport that they describe the world as it is in and of itself. So if you ask a chemist, what are you doing, right? Well, a chemist will say, if I tell you that water is hydrogen bonded to oxygen, then I'm telling you something about the way the world is, right? Um, I'm describing reality, right? Morality, however, is not a descriptive enterprise. It doesn't purport to tell you what is the case, right? Rather, morality is what's known as a prescriptive, or another word for you is normative, right? Enterprise. Morality, along with its counterpart in axiology being the philosophical study of value, aesthetics, which is the philosophy of art, morality purports to describe the world as it should be, as it ought to be. That's what's characteristic of a normative enterprise. Purports to describe the world as it ought to be. All right, well, what are the features of morality? Sorry, I had a bug on my lens. Um, Morality is unique, right? And it derives its uniqueness from several characteristics. First off, moral norms are overriding. What do you mean by overriding? Moral norms trump all other norms. So if you say, for example, have a conflict between morality and the law, right? If the law, for example, and we'll use a grim example, 1856, the Fugitive Slave Law. If you live in the North, you have to return a fugitive slave law. You have to turn them into authorities so they can be sent back to their owners, right? Um, that would be an example of something that's legal but clearly not moral. Morality always trumps uh, non-moral considerations, right? So that's what we mean when we say moral norms are overriding, right? They they take priority over everything else, right? Two, moral norms are impartial. So if a black student in my class and a Latinx student in my class and a white student in my class, they all three get A's, right? And 2 or 3 years down the line, they come to me and they ask for a letter of recommendation. They're applying to grad school, right? Uh, and they all got good grades. They all got good grades in my class, and they ask for letters of recommendation. And I give a letter of recommendation to the white student. Then I must, if I'm going to be consistent, right? And this is one of the big parts of moral reasoning, something known as the consistency principle, or principle of equal treatment. And it's very simple and straightforward. But if you've ever wondered what makes racism wrong, what makes sexism wrong, what makes ageism wrong, etc., it's this, right? It's the violation of the consistency principle. Consistency principle. Like cases ought to be treated in the same way unless there's a very good reason for treating them differently. In this case, there is no reason for treating them differently, right? We demand that moral norms and morality be impartial. Now, I'm going to hang an asterisk on this, and we'll see why in a little bit. Third, moral norms are universal. If it's wrong to enslave a person in August 1856, then it is wrong to enslave them on August 26th, 2020, right? So why emphasize this so much? Because there is a common misconception, and it's very prevalent among young people. Morality is relative, right? So many people equate moral relativism with moral tolerance. No. Moral relativism, as we'll see next week, we talk about that theory next week, is an absolutely, well, we won't talk about it next week. We'll talk about divine command theory, but we might get to moral relativism. But anyway, Regardless, it's an absolutely awful theory. It's just terrible, right? There are actions that are awful that should not be done, regardless of the historical cultural context, right? Slavery is one, right? And we can list numerous other examples, right? Some things are never justified, ever. It's not for any reason. Genocide, slavery, etc. Some things are always generally good, right? Kindness, generosity, friendship, right? Universality. 4, morality is reason driven. If something is good to do, then we ought to have reasons we should be able to offer reasons for doing it, right? So if it's good to give to charity, we should be able to offer reasons for why it's good to give to charity, right? Why is it good to give to charity? Because some people, some parties in our society are less well off than others, right? And they're to refuse to help when we're in a position to help is to violate one's basic humanity, right? And we'll talk about that in a bit. This is going to tie into this next part that unfortunately Rachel's they are very typical philosophers, father and son duo. But they're very typical in that they emphasize reason above all else, and that's very philosophical. I mean, that's the name of the game with philosophy. But as is philosophers becoming increasingly aware, that's not the end of the game, right? All right. So let me talk to you then about what's not in Rachel's text that's so important. There is a psychological capacity that every human being ostensibly is born with. It's called empathy. Empathy is that psychological capacity that allows you to temporarily suspend your own emotional state so that you can experience someone else's emotional state as if it were your own. If you do not have a capacity for empathy, you suffer from what psychologists call antisocial personality disorder. You are a sociopath. Now, I know you're thinking, okay, what's the difference between a socio and a psychopath? A psychopath is ostensibly someone who was born without a capacity for empathy. Most psychologists today, based on the research, do not believe that anyone is born without a capacity for empathy. Rather, if you lack a capacity for empathy, you're a sociopath. That means due to societal factors like repeated exposure to violence or, believe it or not, flattery, yes, flattery, right? Excessive flattery, you can lose your capacity for empathy, right? Without a capacity for empathy, you can be law-abiding, but you cannot be moral, right? It's one thing to follow the law, and most sociopaths do. Again, contrary to stereotypes, most sociopaths don't wear hockey masks and wield machetes and chop people up, right? It is true that every serial killer is a sociopath, but it's not true that all sociopaths are serial killers. In fact, the vast majority of them aren't. Believe it or not, and this is not a joke, sociopaths make great white-collar middle management. Because when it's time for layoffs, they don't see people, right? They can't empathize with people under plight. They just sign pink slips. True story, right? In order to be a moral person, right, you've got to have an emotional reaction to the events that you see. That's what informs the empathy, right? So philosophers have historically neglected this. The first philosopher to talk about the importance of empathy to ethics in depth was the great Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century in his treatise of human nature. And most philosophers since then have, let it go in one ear, out the other, with the exception of one very important group of philosophers. And we're coming back to that asterisk I mentioned earlier, right? There's a group of philosophers known as the feminist care ethicists, right? And they recognize you can't always be impartial in your moral dealings. It's impossible. Consider, you're at a beach with your child. Your child's 5, right? Your child is splashing around in the water. You're on the beach, and a stranger's child is equidistant from you. Now, at exactly the same time, your child and the stranger's child get a cramp. They're both going to drown. You can only save one. Of course, you're going to save your child. Why? Because you spent 5 years building and cultivating an interpersonal relationship with your child. Our interpersonal relationships, our friendships, our intimate, the people we're intimate with, right? Our family, they deserve preference, right? Because interpersonal relationships matter. This is the brilliant insight of Carol Gilligan and the feminist care ethicists, right? So we can't always be impartial. Impartiality is important, but we can't always be impartial. All right. So next week we'll start to examine divine command theory. Divine command theory is the doctrine that God or gods dictate what is right and wrong.